I'm Ryan, and this is my presentation on my tips and tricks for writing in college, a guide for first-year students. So first I want to start off on why academic writing feels so different in college compared to high school. In high school, it was a lot of just reporting information, find the correct answer, and make your professor happy. But in college, it's actually pretty different. In college, it's more about joining a conversation and adding your own ideas. So writing isn't actually just about finding the right answer and restating it. It's about adding your own ideas and conclusions to an ongoing conversation. Something that helped me a lot in not only reading but also writing is to understand the fact that authors are claim makers. You should treat the text as claims and not facts. I used to think that everything I read in school was just already a proven fact and that there was no challenging that, but that's not actually true. You can challenge what the author is saying. Something that's also helped me in writing is to not get caught up in the facts, to add my own ideas. I'll show you in a moment here an example between Janet and Roger from Penrose and Geisler's Reading and Writing Without Authority. I picked out a quote here that I liked. It talks about how Roger can speak with authority, he can be playful, tentative, and exploratory, and how he can and does change his mind as his examples point out inconsistencies in his thinking. He's not afraid to challenge the claims of other authors, but also his own previous claims, and together with the reader, him and the reader can come to a conclusion. Janet, in this text, she's too focused on the facts and finding the truth. It mentions the information transfer model. I think that's kind of what we learned a lot in high school. Back to my previous example of just trying to find the right answer and just restating it. But that's a pretty restrictive way of thinking and reading and writing. So you really want to try and walk the reader through your thinking. Something I personally struggled with in writing is trying to come up with a conclusion before I start writing. But that's not how you should write. It makes writing difficult, and it's also not very valuable to the reader. If you lay out your ideas and your claims and you work through them together with the reader, it's a lot more valuable for the reader. And like from the example above, be willing to change your mind about stuff. Roger was able to explore his own claims and eventually reach a conclusion together with the reader in the end. Another thing that can be difficult, especially as you are learning to write, is to write with authority. Some points that I find helpful personally for writing with authority is to add to the conversation. Do your research, mention prior knowledge in your paper, and kind of get the reader up to speed with where you're at. Not only can that make it easier for the reader to comprehend, but it can also show them that you know what you're talking about, which gives you a voice of authority. And that really shows that you've done your research. And then you can take your claims and back them up with citations. From Thoney's paper, he mentions that another way that writers can create an ethos of authority is by using high percentage of meaning-carrying words. So kind of the idea of writing concisely. That's not something I remember being taught much in high school. I was more focused on just reaching a word count, so I kind of tended to stretch stuff out, but that's not very good writing. You do want to be concise, and writing concisely also gives you a voice of authority. And a good way to do that is to utilize lexes, words unique to the discourse community that you're talking to. It's good for authority, writing concisely, and making your point clear to your intended audience. Here are my references if you would like to read more about what I'm talking about. I do find the first one from Penrose and Geisler to be very helpful. It lays out a great example between Janet and Roger and different types of writing. Janet's a first-year student and Roger has a PhD. And there's a very obvious difference between the two. And using that example has helped me a lot in trying to be more of a writer like Roger.